Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and you are watching a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I would like to invite you to a trip to the Pacific because I would like to present you a review of a game that I have already opened and that I have already unboxed on my channel, but some time ago. Now the time has come to prepare the review. This will be the review of Across the Pacific, a game published in 2010 by Pacific Rim Publishing. The author of this game is Michael Myers. It is a title for 2 players and the time of play will be somewhere around 12-14 hours if you play the entire campaign. So this will be a monster game. Fortunately, we also receive some additional smaller scale scenarios which allow you to play during 1 to 3 hours and also have fun with this system. The game, as you might expect, will reconstruct the Second World War on the Pacific, so it will enable us to simulate the titanic struggle between the Empire of Japan, started in December 1941, and the United States of America, concluding in 1945. The game will be played on a series of 9 turns, but those turns will be quite complex because the game will be using not only a very long turn sequence, it will also be using the cheat pool system and in 2 different categories because you'll be using both tactical cheats and strategical cheats. Because of this, the sequence of play, as I said earlier, is quite long. Today I would like to show you how this game looks, what are its components, what are its key and most interesting mechanics, and then I would like to give you my final thoughts and my opinion about this title. So let's begin and let's check how the elements of Across the Pacific look.
Here is Across the Pacific from Pacific Rim Publishing and Michael Myers. Now, this is a huge game, this is a monster game in my opinion, a game which, if you play the entire campaign, will take several dozens of hours, up to 18 or even 20, you will play the whole weekend, although this game lasts only 9 turns, but those turns are really complex, are really long. Now, first of all, what we receive in this huge box? We receive a map depicting the whole or the majority of the Pacific Ocean from the Asian coast up to Hawaii. So the western coast of the US is not represented because it wasn't a theater of conflict during the war, so only Hawaii are presented on the eastern part of the map. Apart from that, we have Southeast Asia, we have the home islands, we have the whole Dutch East Indies with Borneo, with Java, Sumatra, with New Guinea. We get Australia and all the other islands which were controlled by the US or by the Japanese forces at some time. So the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands and all the others which were so important during the Second World War. So we have Okinawa, we have Iwo Jima, we have Peleliu, Tarawa, etc. A lot of them is on this map. Now, as you can see, this map has also a hexagonal grid on it. It's important both for movement, for calculating range, also for initial setup because some units are located in specific hexes. Now, we receive several scenarios in Across the Pacific. It is possible to play not only the whole campaign, which is a very long game, but also some smaller scale scenarios, including also a solitaire scenario, which depicts the initial stages of World War II on the Pacific. And this is an interesting scenario because it is also an introductory scenario which will enable you to learn how the game works. And this is a nice approach, a nice idea to start by this scenario. This is a solitaire scenario in which you will try to take control of the Japanese forces and do better than the Japanese did during the opening stages of World War II on the Pacific. So you will try to reach and maybe surpass a certain benchmark of points. Those points will be granted for controlling airfields, for controlling anchorages, for destroying enemy units, and also for some other factors. Apart from that, we get also a short Midway scenario, a shorter Guadalcanal scenario, and the whole Across the Pacific campaign. Now, what is important in Across the Pacific is not only to learn how to play the game, it's also important to study the victory conditions, because we can just take a look at the victory conditions which are on the last page. As you can see, they are quite complex. It's not like in some games where you have the information to win, you have to take Berlin, or in order to win, you have to gather 100 points, and those points are attributed for controlling victory places and for destroying enemy units. No. Across the Pacific works in a different way. You have very complex victory conditions. For instance, one of them at random: control at least one oil resource hex and the Malaya resource hex, and have a valid network of air umbrellas stretching from that oil resource hex through the Malaya resource hex to any airfield in the Japanese home islands. And mind, this is only one of the conditions. You have to accomplish all of them. So this is really complex, and this applies to the majority of the scenarios where you really have to take a really close look at those victory conditions, because knowing how to play the game doesn't mean that you will play it correctly in order to achieve victory. You have to not only master the rules, you also have to master the victory conditions and know what to do in order to achieve your objectives. So this is an interesting approach. Those victory conditions, in my opinion, are well suited to the situation. They try to represent how the objectives, the real objectives of both sides looked during this struggle on the Pacific. So this is also a way to simulate what were the goals of both sides and what were their ambitions. So understanding this also helps to understand the victory conditions. The game is played through using a sequence of play. As you can see, it's a huge sequence of play, and during the turns you will be doing tons of things. You'll be placing new units on the map board, because what you see right now is only a part of everything that you receive in the gaming box. You receive tons of over counters, 800 or 900 counters, which I sorted, as you can see, in different bags in accordance to the turn number in which they appear in the game, both the Allied ones and the Japanese ones, with the number corresponding to the turn during which those counters, those forces appear on the map. So you'll be placing new units, you'll be moving new units, you'll be creating task forces, you'll be rebasing air units, you'll also be adding new resource points, etc. But describing this sequence of play would be very mechanical. I'd prefer not to pass through all those points, but to tell you what are the interesting mechanics which, in my opinion, are part of this design. The first thing which should be explained, which should be underlined, is the fact that we have three distinctive theaters in this on this map board, and the Japanese player can activate one of them during the first turn. Then the other theater is activated only on turn 6 or 5, and the last one on turn 8 or 9. This is important because this decision of activating a theater by the Japanese player means that he'll be focusing on this theater. And we get 3 of them, as I said. The first one, which is a theater which will never be chosen by the Japanese at the game start, is the Russian theater. So Manchuria, Manchukuo, Yehol. This is a theater which will be activated at the game's end during the Great Campaign. But the 2 others have to be, one of them has to be chosen by the Japanese player. The first one is the Chinese theater, and the second one is the Southern theater, which encompasses all the Pacific, so all the islands, but also Indochina, Thailand, Burma, India, and Malaya. Now, this is a very important decision to take by the Japanese player, because when choosing a theater, players cannot launch ground attacks or on other theaters. So if the Japanese player decides to activate China, this means that he'll almost certainly resign from taking control of the entire southern part of the board. Now, this might seem strange, but it is an interesting approach, because it enables us to answer to a question: what would happen if the Japanese decided to concentrate fully on taking China, on controlling this massive country, and on trying to secure its resources? The different approach is the historical one, in which the Japanese will launch a southern offensive, will try to take the Philippines, will try to take eastern Dutch Indies, in which the Japanese will try to take control of important resource slots such as Palembang or Brunei, in order to fuel their war effort. So this is one thing which I like in this game. It's the fact that you can try a different approach playing by the Japanese, and the 2 games are played in a very different way, because if you decide to concentrate solely on China, the southern theater will be quite silent during the first few turns. The Americans will be, of course, trying to build their forces, but they will try in some way to reinforce their Chinese ally. The second thing which I like in this game is the fact that it has a specific approach to resource management, because in some games we are additionally tracking resources such as fuel, such as petroleum, such as food or other stuff which is important in terms of making war. But in this game it's very, very simplified. You get a certain number of POL markers, which are petroleum oil lubricants markers, which enable you to activate your task forces. Because in order to create a task force, you have to spend such a POL marker. Now, as you might expect, the Allies, the Americans, have absolutely no problem with it, because they receive each turn a certain number of POL markers. But the Japanese have a certain number of those markers at the game start, but they do not receive automatically such additional markers. They have to take control of spaces which produce resources, and additionally be able to transport those resources to the home islands. Without it, they won't be able to create task forces. So this is a nice way to simulate this resource management aspect, which is extremely simplified, but which works extremely good. The third thing are the task forces, which I already mentioned a few times. Because if you take a closer look at the board, you'll see that we have some task force markers here and there, which represent task forces created both by the Japanese and by the Allied player. Now, the rules say that you can use your naval units in 2 ways. You can use them as task groups and task forces. Task groups are very efficient. They are small vessels grouped in order to operate quickly and to achieve surprise. But the Negative aspect of task groups is that you cannot use capital ships in those task groups. In order to use your capital ships, so for instance your battleships or your carriers, you have to create task forces spending POL markers. Now, if you do create such a task force, you'll be using your special task force chart where you will create a specific task force. As you can see, we have three kinds of them. We have the A task forces, which are meant to be amphibious forces, which will be created in order to take some specific locations, to land on islands. Then you have B task forces, which will be created especially to intercept opposing naval forces, to engage them in naval combat. And you get the sea forces, which will be the forces including your carriers, which will be used in order to launch carrier airstrikes against enemy targets. You get also a chart on which you'll be placing your air units which will be on board of your carriers. As you can see, we have slots for aircraft and also for the corresponding CEL markers, which are combat efficiency level markers, which is another interesting mechanism in this game. Because if we compare Allied units, especially Allied aircraft, to Japanese aircraft, you'll see that Allied aircraft have always an additional number which can range from -2 to +2. Here it is 0, but we get also aircraft with, for instance, -1 modifiers. This is the CEL, the combat efficiency level of a unit, which represents its experience, its equipment, its morale, or other aspects which can influence combat efficiency. Japanese units, units, do not have this parameter directly on the counter. Japanese aircraft have an additional marker which is added to such a counter. Now you might wonder why differentiate those two aspects. Why differentiate combat efficiency level in such a way for the Japanese and for the Allies? And the answer is, this is a way to simulate the differences in the combat efficiency level of the Japanese and the Allies that they had during the Pacific War. As you know, the Japanese used very highly trained, experienced airmen during the first months of World War II. They used them both during the Pearl Harbor raid, during the Battle of Midway, or the battle on the Coral Sea. And those pilots granted Japanese a huge advantage because they were far superior to American pilots. But the losses that they sustained were irreplaceable, were terrible, because the combat efficiency of the Japanese airmen gradually declined during the war. In contrary, the combat efficiency level of Allied units increases during gameplay, and it increased during the war. Now, this mechanism is here in order to grant the player an opportunity to play in a different way than the Japanese managed their resources during World War II. So it enables the player to try a different approach, because there is a phase during the game in which the Japanese player can transfer those CL markers between aircraft. So if we receive as replacements, as reinforcements, new aircraft which are of better quality, which have better stats, we can decide to give those aircraft to experienced pilots who still are on the board, who didn't die. or we can decide to keep those markers with the previous machines. It's up to us. So we can follow the path that the Japanese took during World War II, when they kept the experienced players on the front, but also they took high casualties and they weren't able to replace those pilots by high quality new pilots. Or we can try to maneuver those resources to try to maybe create some strike forces where we want with high efficiency pilots. I like this mechanism a lot because it's a simple way to simulate the differences in combat efficiency between the Japanese and the Americans. Of course, as in all games including Japanese aircraft, we have the kamikaze mechanics, which enables us to launch kamikaze attacks using units having a combat efficiency level of -2, so the weakest pilots can be used as kamikazes. Because this marker or this parameter on markers indicates also the modifier which is used during die rolls when resolving combat. As you might expect, +2 is a good modifier, -2 is a lousy modifier, which at most times will cause you not to score a hit, but to get a miss during your attacks. What I like and what I think also is interesting in this game, which deserves to be mentioned, is an interesting mechanic which is called the air umbrella. Now, the air umbrella is something of a zone of control exerted by air units, by level and strategic bombers. Now, each aircraft marker has a certain range, and those level bombers or strategic bombers exert a certain zone of influence, which is called an air umbrella. So having multiple units, for instance, those units in different locations, enables you to exert overlapping or adjoining zones of control, those air umbrellas. So having in your air umbrella a big part of the board enables you to have some benefits. Not only it enables you to transfer units more quickly, it also enables you to achieve some victory conditions, because some victory conditions require you to have an air umbrella in certain locations. So this is also a nice way to simulate how the struggle on the Pacific looked like, because taking Okinawa by the Allies or taking Iwo Jima was not just to take the island. More precious from the soil were the airfields located on those islands. They enabled the Allies to launch airstrikes against the home islands. So having in range the opponent's territory, thanks to your strategic or level bombers, enables you to launch very powerful attacks. And this air umbrella mechanic tries to simulate this struggle for the control of the air, which was, if not as important as controlling the seas, maybe even more important than this aspect. Now, we get also other interesting mechanics. We get, for instance, the Banzai rule governing ground combat. We can cause the total collapse of the Burman front, which also will cause some problems to the British, who will not aid sufficiently Americans at such a way. We have the Doolittle ride, which also enables us to recreate this historical event. We get combat air patrols, so we can decide to fly patrol missions in order to control or rather protect our airfields or our forces from destruction. We have parachute units, we have island hopping, we have some transport units or other vessels which can transport landing ground units. we get also the magic mechanic, which is also a nice addition, because this is another mechanic which also simulates how the war looked like, because starting on turn 2, during the strategic phase, the allied player may decide to place back into the cup one cheat which was drawn during this phase and redraw, because Across the Pacific is a game using the cheat pool system. I have showed you how the structure of a turn looks like, but the majority of the turn will be played during the cheat pool system, during which first of all we'll be drawing strategic cheats, and after that we'll be drawing tactical cheats. Using magic, so this special mechanism allows the American player to replace one of those strategical counters drawn into the cup and draw a new cheat. Now those cheats enable us, for instance, to rebase task groups, to deploy task forces, to fly CAPs, to fly ground support, or to move ground units. After resolving all those cheats, we resolve the tactical cheats, which are also drawn randomly from a cup, and those cheats enable you to sortie with your task groups or to activate your different task forces, both the amphibious landing forces, the interception forces, or the carrier attacks, or launch land-based airstrike. Now, as you can see, the game lasts only 9 turns, but those turns are really long. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time both to think about your moves, how to optimize the usement of your forces, and those are, in a very general way, the basic mechanics of Across the Pacific. Now, I wouldn't like now to spend more time on explaining some details, because this is not meant to be a tutorial of the game. This game deserves a highly detailed tutorial. The last thing maybe that I show you are the 2-player aids, because what might be surprising is the fact that for a monster game we get only those 2-player aid charts. The first one has the sequence of play and also an information about how to resolve naval combat. It has also a depiction of the different units and counters, which is extremely useful. The second one has all the tables used to resolve combat. I haven't spoken about combat, so this is an occasion just to briefly explain how it works. Now, we get several tables which are used, different charts which are used to resolve combat. We have charts for resolving ground combats. We have also charts which are used for torpedo, dive bombing, and level bombing. As you can see, only one table to resolve all those types of attacks, but using different rows. As you can see, depending on the torpedo factors or dive bombing factors, we'll be looking at a certain column, launch one die and verify the result. Then we have also the kamikaze combat. We get also a special chart for naval surface combat, where we'll be verifying the attacker-defender ratio and also rolling the die with some modifiers, and the air-to-air anti-aircraft strafing and airfield bombardment, also with three different rows, using the ratio or just using the strength of the attacking units. I like this approach because the game comes only with one 6-sided die, as you can see. It uses only those charts to resolve combat without tons of additional modifiers. Apart from the CEL modifier for units, there is really not much more to add, and I love this approach because there are some games which use really a lot of die roll modifiers, column shifts. Here it's very simple, it's at the same time very functional and very dynamic. Those battles are resolved in such a way that we really always are very implicated in those battles, and they tend to be epic. I like them a lot. So now I'd like to pass to the conclusion. I'd like to tell you what I think about this game, how I liked it, what I think are its strong, but also what are the a little bit weaker points.
Across the Pacific is without any doubt a monster game. It has 800 or 900 counters, it has a huge map and a long time of play. Fortunately, as I said already at the beginning of this video, you also receive some smaller scale scenarios which allow you to play shorter games using only part of all this huge number of components. When we speak of Pacific war games, we very often cite, for instance, Empire of the Sun, Asia Engulfed. Across the Pacific is, if not never, then very rarely mentioned. And this is a pity because Across the Pacific is a really outstanding game. And I would like to explain you why I think that it is a very good title. Now, I would like to begin, as always, by telling you a few words about the visual aspects, about the functionality of all the elements that we receive. What I like in Across the Pacific is the fact that the counters which we receive are very well presented. They are very functional with not a lot of data on them, but with information which is very easily understood. Now, if you watched my unboxing of this game, when unboxing this title, I have found one of the counter sheets having displaced counters. And even when looking at this review, some of my counters are somewhat displaced, but without influencing the data or the information which is printed on them. Well, this one counter sheet was really displaced, so I contacted Pacific Rim Publishing in order to tell them that I received a copy of the game having this issue. And Pacific Rim Publishing explained that this was a mistake. They sent me, of course, a replacement sheet, and also they added a small letter explaining why the delay in sending this counter sheet. Well, this was due to some personal issues, and I was really thankful for it, because I always judge games and companies not basing on the errors which happened during production, during game assembly, because it can and it will always happen in this hobby, and not only in wargaming, in gaming in general. It happens everywhere where we have production, and errors, mistakes is something that just happens. I'm always judging companies basing on its customer care and on its reaction to my problems that I had or that I experienced. So Pacific Rim Publishing deserves a big thumbs up for its reaction, for its customer care, because they reacted just as I want companies to react to such problems. Okay, I had a problem with a counter sheet. They accepted, they send me free of charge a new replacement counter sheet. I receive additionally a letter explaining why the delay and with some words of excuse. That's it, that's everything that I expect. So thank you Pacific Rim Publishing for showing how it should be done. This is a high quality customer care. I'm really glad that I could have experienced such a treatment. Now, passing to the counters, because this was only an off topic. The counters, as I said earlier, are very clear, are very well structured. They are somewhat old school. The same applies to the game map, but I do not have absolutely any problem with it. This is a style of artwork. Well, some people might say that the colors were not well chosen, that the map is not sufficiently detailed, it has not a lot of terrain feature, but I'd say it's good. It's a very good decision because we have tons of war games in which we have terrain effects charts taking a whole a whole player's aid with different movement factors needed to be spent to move through such spaces with different effects concerning combat on such terrain, such as die roll modifiers, column modifiers. This is clumsy, this is complicated, and it applies to tactical games. Here it's a strategical game which at its scope should allow us to play the entire Second World War on the Pacific, and it's good that the map is quite simple, it's elegant, it's easy to tell where the islands end, what are the boundaries, what are the terrain features. It's just as it should be. Now, what I enjoy the most in Across the Pacific is its mechanics. So now I would like to explain you why. Because this game has quite unique mechanics, which I haven't seen earlier in war games, or which I have seen in war games, but now in Across the Pacific I had a different experience when playing them, because there was somewhat a different approach to some of them. Now, I have already explained some of those mechanics. For instance, the POL markers, which recreate in a very simple but at the same time with a very elegant way the economical aspect of the struggle on the Pacific. And this is a nice simplification, because in this game you'll receive a lot of detailed rules governing some aspects of the war, but at the same time some others which were important were simplified. The terrain features are one of them. The POL markers are another. The combat resolution system is again one of those elements. And it's good because games should be fun. Games which require you to track hull damage, which require you to count distance and see what types of weapons you can use, are fun for people who like such games. For people who search for games trying to cover the whole war, on the Pacific or over or in Europe or elsewhere, we're looking for simplified mechanics which will enable us to recreate some elements of the war, but which will not add a lot of details and a lot of accountancy to the game. And in Across the Pacific, it's at an excellent level, because you still get some economical elements, some combat details, but at a level which is just as it should be. It doesn't take fun from the game, but at the same time it still incorporates them into the game and tells you, here is the combat system, here is the economy inside the game. And I like it a lot. So I like this designing philosophy. Even better, what I like is the fact that both Michael Myers and the developer of this game decided to create not only a playable game, but also a game in which it will be up to the players to shape their own future. Now, we have a lot of war games in which players are able to make decisions different than in history, but then the game mechanics punish them or give them some advantages if they follow, or if they follow the right path, or if they decide to go elsewhere. Otherwise, also we receive some games in which events which happen or turn entry of some mega powerful units will make players return to the historical path. Here it's up to the players. In Across the Pacific, you can decide to skip attack on Pearl Harbor. You can decide to concentrate on China, not take the Dutch East Indies. You can omit, for instance, attacking Wake Island, Midway Island. you can create a strategical reserve in Japan and try to avoid committing your best airmen to combat. You can, while playing with the Americans, omit taking Peleliu, Tarawa. You can try, for instance, to go ahead and try to knock down Japan, directly trying to attack the Japanese islands. It's up to you. So I like it really a lot, because it's up to the players to decide what they will do and when they will do it. One of the sole exceptions is the fact that the Soviets will enter the war only at the game's end. But this is understandable, because if not such a strict rule, then the Soviet roller coaster would cause the Japanese to collapse very quickly. So this is, if I'm correct, the only major restraint which is imposed during the game. Now, I have said that this game has some interesting mechanics. I have already spoken about the POL markers. What I really enjoyed is this mechanic which is related to the experience of Japanese airmen, so the CEL markers. I love this because at first, when I discovered the rules, when I took a look at the counters, I was wondering why to differentiate those two elements, because at first I read the rule book and only then I decided to read the designer's book. If I decided to read the designer's book, I would understand from the beginning why such a decision. But I was scratching my head: why to differentiate it? Why to create additional markers? I do not like additional markers. Why they are here? But then when I understood why they were here, I was just smashed. I was thrilled. It was excellent. It is an excellent idea. It is an excellent mechanic. Not only it simulates in a fantastic way how this experience of Japanese airmen was influential when it comes to their combat efficiency, to the combat efficiency of Japanese air units and also of Japanese carriers. It allows the players to relocate those counters, to decide where, when to use your best airmen or when to spare them and send rookies, because maybe they will do the job, because it's crucial to keep those experienced and highly skilled airmen alive. I love it. It's a great mechanic. It's again another rule which shows you how open this system and this game is. The same applies to other interesting mechanics concerning task forces, concerning air umbrellas, which are again an excellent and very interesting mechanic, because air umbrellas not only show you how important it was during the Second World War on the Pacific to control the air, it also simulates in a nice way what were the long-term strategical objectives, especially of the Allies. Well, the Japanese didn't have any strategical bombers. They had level bombers which had a reduced possibility to create those spheres of influence. They tried to do it, but they were overwhelmed by the Allied air forces. It is a nice mechanic because it really underlines how this aspect of the war was important. You will not be taking an island very often to keep units on it. You'll be taking it in order to increase your air umbrellas, and the fact that you also have to achieve such air umbrellas, install such air umbrellas in order to win, because they are included in the victory conditions, makes them even more important. Now, what I like in this game is also the cheat pool system, because it's different from many other games. You get two types of cheats. You get both tactical cheats and strategical cheats, And this is also a way to introduce fog of war into this game. Fog of war in Pacific games is a must-have. It's something that has to happen. It's a way to simulate this uncertainty which commanders on the Pacific encountered, but at the same time introducing, for instance, the magic counter from the Allied perspective simulates their high reconnaissance capacities and radar technology. But this cheat pool system works really fine in this game. You have always to plan ahead. You have to take into consideration what you will do if opponents' cheats appear earlier than yours. You have to be prepared in order to sometimes repulse attacks, to take some damage in order then to counterattack and achieve your objectives. I like that you receive not only the campaign, the long campaign mode, but also the smaller scale scenarios, which allow you to better understand how the game works when you learn it, and then to play it also if you have less time. Because don't be fooled, this is still a monster game. This is a game which takes a lot of place, which takes a lot of time, not only to play it, but also to learn it. And when searching for weaker points of this title, I'd say that this monster scale is something that will detract some players. This is maybe one of the reasons why Across the Pacific is not a game which is highly often cited by players searching or recommending games about the Pacific War. It's a shame because, as I said, it has also those shorter scenarios which also shine, which also are very interesting. You get the Guadalcanal scenario, you get the Midway scenario, or the opening the war scenario, in which you can recreate the strike against Pearl Harbor and the Japanese expansion to the south, or you can even try the different approach and try to seize China. So this scale, the fact that you receive nearly 1000 counters, the fact that you have to spend 12 hours or so in order to play the whole game is certainly a thing that will scare some people, and that can be a hindrance. What deserves to be said is that this game is a game that you'll be learning quite slowly. It doesn't have an extremely complicated rulebook, but it is black and white. It doesn't have really a lot of examples, and it introduces original concepts. So learning this game will be a challenge, especially if you decide to play the longer game, which I wouldn't recommend. I'd recommend to start by the shorter scenarios. What I'd also recommend is to take a look at a very extensive after-action report published by Michael Myers, the designer, on Consim World. It's an after-action report which, if I'm correct, has 120 pages or so, with highly detailed information about different aspects of the game, and which recreates the whole campaign in a very entertaining way. We get some examples in the designer's book, both when it comes to surface combat or combats launched by Kaya forces, but still after reading those examples I had some doubts, I had some questions, and many of those questions were answered when reading this after action report. It's a fascinating read. I strongly recommend you take a look at it, even if you don't read the whole example, the whole after action report. You can still search for some information which then become much more easy to understand when you play the game by yourself. Concluding, Across the Pacific is, in my opinion, an excellent game covering the Second World War on the Pacific. A game with interesting, new, refreshing mechanics. A game which allows the players to almost entirely freely decide on how to use the assets, how to approach the Second World War on the Pacific, where to strike, where to concentrate your forces, how to relocate your forces, which doesn't impose a ton of restrictions and micro rules which forbid you to do different things. A game in which you get interesting mechanics, which is simplified in some aspects, but in the positive sense, because it is a playable monster and not an overly complicated monster game. A game in which you have to have a lot of space in order to store this big map. A game with nearly 1000 counters, but fortunately also with some shorter scenarios. If you have the opportunity to try Across the Pacific, don't hesitate and just do it. This was the review of Across the Pacific from Pacific Rim Publishing. Thank you a lot for watching this review. I hope that you will revisit our channel in some time. Have a fantastic day and see you next time.